Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Well, a Republican U.S. Senator, Lindsey Graham, who I know, of course, comes with a lot of baggage whenever he does tweet or speak out on any issue, has nevertheless tweeted about the Biden administration's strategy or possibly lack of when it comes to its withdrawal from Afghanistan, which, as we know, is taking place quite speedily at this point in time, even though the deadline is around September the 11th this year. He's criticized the Biden administration for not bringing Pakistan into the fore enough and not coordinating with Pakistan enough regarding, of course, the pullout from Afghanistan and the future then of Afghanistan as well. As we can imagine, this has been debated many, many times, i.e. the pullout from Afghanistan overall and whether or not it should be happening in this manner overall, and what this then means for neighboring countries such as Pakistan and others who are, of course, looking for peace on the border with Afghanistan as well. Let's discuss that issue and others a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Victoria C. Fontan, who is a professor of peace and conflict studies at the American University of Afghanistan. She's joining us today from Kabul. Joining us from Islamabad is Dr. Imran Ashraf, who is an assistant professor at the Department of International Relations at the National Defense University, Islamabad. And joining us as well from the Pakistani capital is Amina Khan, who is the director of the Center for Middle East and Africa and Afghanistan at the Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad. Amina, Imran, and Victoria, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Imran, I'd like to start with you first. As I said, Lindsey Graham, in and of himself, it comes with a lot of controversies, but what do you make of his statement? Do you think the Biden administration needs to be coordinating more with Pakistan when it comes to what may happen in Afghanistan in the coming days?
Thank you, Waqar. Yes, exactly. At a Senate Appropriations Committee hearing, Lindsey Graham showed concern on U.S. withdrawal policy. And then he onward tweets that it is stunning that President Biden has not reached out to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. He as well adds that U.S. Cannot expect withdrawal from Afghanistan to be effective without coordinating with Pakistan. And clearly the Biden administration believes, as per Graham, that problems in Afghanistan are behind the U.S. Graham believes as well that this decision by Biden administration to withdraw all forces and not stay engaged with Pakistan is a major disaster, even worse than the blunder of Iraq. Yes, exactly. I would like to recall the two important occasions, to the Mr. Biden. The one was then when he was in Obama administration. He visited Afghanistan, and on coming back to U.S. from Afghanistan, Biden told the Council on Foreign Relations in 2008 that okay, we are to continue the support to the Afghanistan in order to have a political settlement, and it is difficult to withdraw all the forces from Afghanistan without having been a political statement. And I remember, and if I can recall Biden, where Biden hardly argued for abandoning Afghanistan. At that time, he said, if Afghanistan fails and Pakistan falls prey to fundamentalism, both countries will pay a heavy price, and America will suffer a terrible strategic setback. So exactly the point is that if at that time, when he was working with Mr. Obama, President Obama, he was of the view that, okay, Pakistan is a very important strategic ally into have a peace within the region. So why not right now? In the second occasion, I would like to recall President
Imran, if I may, if you allow me, I wanted to bring in Amina into the conversation. Of course, I'll get back to you and we can continue the conversation with you as well. Amina, what are your thoughts about the danger for Pakistan and for other neighbors? As I said, I mean, Afghanistan has some important neighbors other than Pakistan as well, but certainly Pakistan is extremely important as we're discussing right now. I mean, the danger of this withdrawal in the fashion that it's taking place without a lot of coordination, at least seemingly from the outside in. I mean, this sets the region up then possibly for instability too, doesn't it?
I personally feel that it's a completely irresponsible withdrawal. The fact that, the Americans, we were expecting a lot more when President Biden came into power. He said that he would do a review of the process. And I think one was expecting, if anything, the Americans want to withdraw, it should be measured and it should be responsible. We do not see that happening on the ground. As you can see in Afghanistan, not only are the Taliban taking over districts, but then, local militias are being formed. And you can see that these are all ingredients for, a civil strife in the making. And yes, regional countries are extremely concerned about the situation. I know that regional countries, including Pakistan, have always been pushing for a measured and responsible withdrawal. And by that, we mean that there should be some semblance of stability in Afghanistan before the Americans withdraw. But, they have done it in a very callous manner, and conveniently, the onus or the responsibility of Afghanistan is now being shifted onto the region and more so Pakistan. But I personally feel that considering Pakistan's relationship with Afghanistan and the historical baggage, Pakistan can only support the process. It would be, I think, unfair of the international community and particularly the Americans to put all the onus on the regional countries, including Pakistan. Because to be very honest, it was the Americans that signed the agreement with the Taliban. Yes, the Pakistanis supported it and helped, but at the end of the day, it is the Americans are a signatory, and I think they have a role to play. And for that, I want to just go back on to the agreement that was signed between the Americans and the Taliban. I mean, apart from getting counterterrorism assurances, nothing really much was achieved. What about the ceasefire? What about the intra-Afghan talks? And of course, what kind of a future political setup do we envisage in Afghanistan? President Ghani is unwilling to move forward. He has created a number of hurdles. Similarly, the Taliban are unwilling to engage. And the fact that both sides cannot even sit and move forward, the Doha process is going nowhere. So I think there is still time to salvage the situation. And of course, the Americans, they feel that they have achieved what they wanted to achieve in Afghanistan, which is again debatable. But I think they have a responsibility to create some sort of semblance in Afghanistan before they withdraw.
Victoria, no, I don't want to just harp on Biden because I know that obviously he's come into a situation where Americans too are tired of this forever war, this war in Afghanistan, which has been going on for a very, very long time. But then as far as the responsible way to do this, I mean, we know that even the Afghan government, certainly the government of Ashraf Ghani, is also unhappy with the way the withdrawal is being sped up. I mean, he is to meet Biden fairly soon, and probably he will ask that the withdrawal be slowed down. So, I mean, if so many parties, the regional countries, as well as the Kabul government are unhappy with this, is this just down to then domestic politics as Biden is doing this then, do you think?
Well, I'm not so certain. And to go back to Senator Graham's tweet, he's an astute observer of regional politics. He knows Afghanistan really well, and he really has Afghanistan's best interest at heart. And he definitely raises a really important question with regards to this responsible withdrawal. At the same time, so much has been invested in Afghanistan. Not much has been achieved in terms of a political settlement. There has been spoilers on all sides, and it is understandable that the Biden administration would want to withdraw in those circumstances. What's really important to see at the moment is that in the recent few days, there have been popular mobilizations in northwest, north, and northeast of Afghanistan that show that it's not just militias, but that shows that there is not popular support for the Taliban, and that the Afghan population and the civil society that has been really growing in terms of its commitment to human rights, to democracy, and to freedom, that part of the population is rising against the Taliban. And that's really the story of the last few days. And I think that no administration, whether it is the American administration or the Afghan central administration, even regional powers, could have foreseen that. And so, talking about a responsible withdrawal is one thing, but placing the onus on the Afghan people as well to say and decide what they want and do not want is also as important as placing the blame on the Biden administration at this time. They have done everything that they can, and yet the responsibility is with the people of Afghanistan to say no to the Taliban if they don't want them.
Imran, there is a meeting that has taken place as well between Foreign Minister Qureshi of Pakistan as well as Iran's Special Envoy in Afghanistan, Mohammad Ibrahim Tahirian Fard. Iran, of course, and Pakistan, both important neighboring countries of Afghanistan. For both of them, I would imagine stability in Afghanistan is of great concern. What are your thoughts about if the regional countries then, such as Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, working together can ensure that things can be stable going forward?
Yes, exactly. Regional countries and the Pakistan and the Iran, they are the stakeholders of the process, so the whole process. And, Pakistan assisted and Pakistan provided support and played a constructive role into the U.S. Talks with the Taliban. That is a key to formalizing the, U.S. Taliban peace agreement of 2020. Yes, exactly. The Iran is a stakeholder into it. So that's why, in my viewpoint, yes, regional connectivity and ongoing regional partnerships in terms of geocommerce, it is very important to take on board the Iran as well and rest of the regional countries as well. And right now, it's not it has not become the limelight of the media when Mr. Biden met with the Russian president, but as well, the Russian president and the Biden, they might have discussed the similar things when the US is withdrawing forces from Afghanistan. So yes, regional countries are important. Number two is that, okay, when China's BRI is in progress and Iran onward is becoming the energy hub of the BRI for this region. So that's why having a CPEC, Pakistan is very important country to connect the China onward to the Middle Eastern countries and to the West Asia onward, and that's on. So that's why Iran and Pakistan's collaboration into having a regional peace, it's very important.
Okay, so Amna, what are your thoughts about the ability of the region to handle this itself? I mean, I know that's a very heavy-handed question, but do you think that if all of Afghanistan's neighbors, along with the Afghans themselves, were to then unite and to try to figure this out on their own, is that doable?
Look, certainly, despite their diverging differences and their differences in the past, I think now all regional countries appear to be on the same page, and they have this regional consensus, which we've seen, which clearly, is based on regional recognition. They don't want the international community to keep on bailing it out. There is ownership of the region, and that obviously includes Afghanistan, the peace process, bringing stability to Afghanistan, and recognizing the Taliban as a pivotal factor to the negotiated settlement. This also includes, defeating transnational terrorist elements such as the ISKP, which is a major threat to all these countries that have just been mentioned. Now, while I say there's a regional consensus, please remember that I think this has come at a very late stage, in the overall, if we look at the events. If this had even happened after the US-Taliban agreement, where you had pushed for a regional consensus, I think, something could have been salvaged. The problem is that all these regional countries are now out to secure themselves from the possible consequences that will occur after the US exit. Now, China, Pakistan, Iran, the Russians, they will continue to provide political, economic, and somewhat developmental assistance. But no regional country is willing to come forward and take over the military or security aspect. They're not in a position to do so. And conveniently, there is a consensus among the regional states that, again, the responsibility is on the Americans, and they've pushed all the onus on the region to take over. And I think that that's disingenuous to do so because they weren't engaged in the first place. And here again with Pakistan, yes, Pakistan has contacts with a number of elements within Afghanistan, and I'm not just talking about the Taliban, but the fact is that because of the history of mistrust between Pakistan and Afghanistan, I wonder whether Pakistan could be that interlocutor that maybe the Americans are looking for, because time and again the blame game it's always Pakistan that is blamed. So therefore, while I do agree with Victoria to a certain extent that the Afghans at the end of the day, have to agree to some sort of a settlement, it's not just about the Taliban or the people accepting or not accepting the Taliban. The fact that the Americans recognize the Taliban as a legitimate stakeholder and signed an agreement shows that there has to be, responsibility and pressures. The Americans need to put pressures on both sides, that is Kabul and the Taliban, to deliver and to come to some sort of a workable agreement. This is pivotal.
Indeed. I'll give you the final word as we're quickly running out of time. I wanted to get your thoughts on Victoria, because you are on the ground then, about the mood in Kabul and from what you can tell across the country about what the coming days, weeks, months are to hold for the country. Is there optimism in the air? Is there worry in the air? And what do you think will happen, realistically speaking, regarding this withdrawal? And once we are post-withdrawal, what does Afghanistan look like then?
Well, as you know, the intensity of the violence has risen in the past few weeks. And so I would say that the mood is quite split between absolute pessimism and the desire to leave the country, but also a certain amount of optimism with regards to some of the events that have occurred in the past few days. And I would say that there is much more support now for the national security forces. And whilst everybody knows that the next few weeks are going to be critical and that the level of violence is going to rise again, I would say that there still is a lot of optimism around, and specifically with regards to the opinion piece of Prime Minister Khan in the Washington Post a couple of days ago, and his recognition that a political settlement above a military solution is important, and the need for regional also involvement. So altogether, a sense of a light at the end of a tunnel, even though the next few weeks are going to be very difficult and critical. But we know that the country is not going to crumble, and we know that we're going to be here next year all together in the same space, and that things are going to go for the best.
We'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate Victoria, Imran, and Amina for taking their time out of their busy schedules to share their expertise with us. We were discussing there mainly the Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, that is, your Republican senator from the United States, who put up a tweet essentially criticizing the Biden administration, saying it wasn't having enough of an outreach to Pakistan, and that can be extended, as I said, to other regional countries. His macro point was that this was a withdrawal of American troops that was being sped up too much for the good of Afghanistan and for the region then. And now we also then have a flurry of meetings, as one can expect, between regional countries. As I mentioned earlier, we've had Pakistani as well as Iranian officials meeting over Afghanistan, and I would imagine that there are other such meetings in the coming days, weeks and months as well set to take place. If the region is to then take the mantle, so to speak, as Amina there had said and alluded to, will it be able to do so? What then will Afghanistan look like going forward? And as Victoria mentioned, Afghans themselves really need to take the lead in this, because it is their country at the end of the day that we are talking about. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the second segment of today's show, we're going to be discussing a number of Iran-related topics. And the first on top of the list is the United States seizing around, I think it is 33 websites, which the United States claims are linked to the Iranian government somehow. So on top of the list, I would imagine for many would be Press TV, which is an English language news channel run by the Iranian government, as well as other outlets such as the Yemeni outlet, which is connected to the Houthi movement, as well as a Palestinian outlet as well. Now, there's a huge debate, obviously, about free speech then online and the kind of control that the U.S. can then have over different websites which may offer differing opinions. The U.S., of course, has said that these sites were taken down because they went against the sanctions and as well were espousing and propagating disinformation. We will discuss that certainly in just in a moment, but I also wanted to then add on that this is all happening, certainly, as we know, during the talks in Vienna. to revive the nuclear deal, to have the Biden administration re-enter the nuclear deal that Donald Trump had walked away from, something that we've discussed a number of times. And on top of that, Iran has also claimed that it has now foiled an act of sabotage against its atomic organization building that resulted in no casualties or damage because very strict or stricter measures were put in place, security measures that is, at all these sites since the attack against and sabotage against Iranian nuclear sites, as well as the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was an Iranian nuclear scientist. Let's put all of those issues to our esteemed panelists who are joining us today. We're joined now by Dr. Farhang Jahanpour, who is an ex-professor and dean at the University of Isfahan. He was also a former senior research scholar at Harvard and has taught at Cambridge and Oxford universities. He's joining us today from Caversham in the UK. Joining us this morning from Sackville, New Brunswick, is Dr. James Devine, who is an associate professor at the Department of Politics and International Relations at Mount Allison University. Farhang and James, thank you both for your time today. Farhang, let me start with you. On this issue of freedom online, right? And so certainly the likes of Press TV and these other websites we can point to would offer a different point of view than we would have American media providing. Do you think that that's the real issue here, or is it really, as the U.S. claims, disinformation and sanctions, etc.?
Thank you very much for having me. Let us take what they say, that they actually spread disinformation. When Iranian government closes down or censors foreign media because they say it spreads disinformation, Western governments condemn it as censorship. In the past few days, the whole world, Western governments and media have been up in arms about Hong Kong closing down a newspaper or a television station. To be honest with you, I was very disappointed and surprised because I expected better. I had expected more from the Biden administration. This action is very reminiscent of the type of neocon policies which Pompeo and Trump and their acolytes were following under their former administration. This is a major attack on freedom of expression, which America claims to be upholding. It undermines faith in American domains, will force countries to go to other sources in the same way that when sanctions are used indiscriminately, it undermines US dollar. And so I think, as I said, I'm disappointed and I'm, to be honest, angry about this very outrageous action.
James, what are your thoughts on that? As I said, of course, the Americans have said that this was because these domains allowed these websites to exist even in contravention of sanctions, and that this information was the real root cause of this. You know, again, the optics here are not very good, certainly.
The Americans, you know, they've got a lot of issues with the Iranian press and the spin that it puts on the news. But really, I think this comes down to the negotiations over the JCPOA. Both the Iranians and the Americans are looking for an agreement sooner rather than later. Both sides would rather have a deal before the new president Raisi is able to take power in August or assume office. So we're coming down to the crunch, and both sides are trying to pressure the other side into making concessions. Although it does appear to be some agreement in principle over what a new deal would look like, there are a number of issues that still separate the two sides. And I think this is a way of the Americans trying to pressure and signal the Iranians that they're going to have to make concessions. Whether it's going to work, I'm very doubtful, but I think this is part of that process.
If this is, and I agree with James that this probably does certainly have to do with the discussions that are taking place in Vienna, and this is, I would think, another pressure tactic. Will this succeed? I mean, I would think that the Iranians would be actually quite sensitive about their own media and allowing for it to be at least online on those domains.
Well, I think this whole idea of doing these things as a form of leverage, which again was used by the former administration, is really problematic. It goes against good faith negotiations. They are engaged in some very important negotiations on nuclear policy and also maybe general Iranian relations with the United States. Now, in the middle of all this, to come up with something like this honestly makes me wonder if President Biden himself knows what is going on, or whether there are people around him and below him who just do these things on their own. Whichever it is, it certainly will not help. As you know, Pompeo last October closed down some 90 Iranian websites and stations. It didn't bring Iran to its knees. It didn't help with the negotiations. To follow on this route of continuing with illegal sanctions, let's not have any bones about them. The sanctions are illegal. The United Nations Security Council, when it supported the JCPOA, said that all sanctions had to be lifted. So the sanctions imposed by Trump and sadly continued by the current administration are illegal. Now, to use these as a form of so-called leverage against Iran, to my mind, is very counterproductive and very problematic.
Let's add another conversation. We're also now joined by Marzieh Hashemi, who is, in fact, an anchor at Press TV. She's a senior anchor with that news channel, and she's also a political analyst and documentary filmmaker. She's joining us today from Tehran. Marzieh, thank you for joining us here in Scope. Wanted to get your reaction, certainly, Marzieh, about these website domain seizures. And secondly, as we've discussed with our other guests so far, that if this really does have to do with the nuclear talks, I mean, will this tactic genuinely pressurize the Iranians, or will it, in fact, harden their resolve?
Well, hello, Waqar. Good to see you, and hello to your viewers. It's not a surprise, unfortunately, because Press TV has been continuously under attack by the U.S. government in various ways, whether we're talking about continually blocking YouTube or social media aspects of Press TV. And of course, I myself was arrested in the United States a couple of years ago, and questions were asked about Press TV. So it's not a surprise what has happened. It is unfortunate. It's an unfortunate reality that we're facing right now, increasing censorship. And it's interesting. It doesn't matter if it's under a Republican presidency or administration or a Democrat. It's basically the same. I mean, we saw an unbelievable amount of pressure on Press TV and other parts of Iran during, of course, the Trump administration, and really nothing has changed. Perhaps just the way that it is being represented, but the actions on the ground are the same. So, in dealing with the nuclear so-called deal, I believe that if Washington thinks that this is going to put pressure and make Iran accept returning to the deal that they didn't leave at first, that the United States left first. Iran's demand is that the United States return to the deal that the United States left. Iran never left the deal and, of course, cut back on its cooperation after a year that the Trump administration left the deal. So I don't think that this type of pressure is going to work, and especially now we have a new administration coming in here in Iran in about a month and a half, and for sure that type of pressure is not going to make Iran give in to it.
James, I want to bring you back in, and I want to ask you then, do you think possibly that the Americans may have gone too far in this regard? Because, I mean, if the stated intention is, listen, we want to get back into the deal, that's what Biden said as candidate, that possibly this was a step too far, targeting media. And then, we've had sort of, at least the Iranians claiming that they've also had this act of sabotage against one of their atomic organization buildings as well. I mean, and I'm not saying that the Americans are necessarily responsible for that. No one has claimed responsibility for that directly, but all of the above seems like it's just too much negativity. And I mean, I would think that affects these talks, doesn't it? That would affect the success of whether or not the Americans get their way in those talks.
Well, I think an unfortunate reality of these sorts of negotiations is that both sides are going to be playing hardball, and the Americans, with closing down Press TV and the other stations, I think they've crossed certain lines in terms of freedom of speech, which are very regrettable and possibly counterproductive. But it's part of a larger pattern of negotiations between the two sides. My understanding is that Press TV and several of these stations were back up online relatively quickly using Iranian servers and Iranian domains. But this is always an issue with pressure tactics and negotiations. Is that you want to signal that you're not going to make concessions. You want to signal that you have resolve, but in the end, it may end up being counterproductive. And again, I mean, both sides are engaged in these sorts of strategies. Iran announcing its has IR-9 centrifuges almost ready to come online. These sorts of things indicate to the Americans that Iran is not going to make concessions and Iran is ready to go forward. But at the same time, too, they inflame the Americans. So this is just this is one of the sort of costs of this sort of negotiating strategy. Whether it's going to really impact things at this point, I don't think this is going to, in and of itself, change the dynamics of the negotiations. I think both sides understand right now that this period is going to be very tense and that both sides will be playing hardball.
Farhang, what are your thoughts about that? Is it, as James has said, that the Iranians are also playing hardball in the sense that they are also then, obviously, as even Marzieh there indicated, upping their nuclear energy program and their uranium enrichment purity as well?
I agree with Dr. Devine. I think they certainly want to use it as a kind of leverage against Iran. But if one thing the 4 years of Trump administration taught us, with his maximum pressure, with crippling sanctions, with all anti-Iranian activities, it further strengthened Iranian resolve to stand up to the United States. I think what it does is alienate that section of the Iranians who are pro-American, because they really see this as an attack on free speech. Unfortunately, there are enough independent voices in the West. As you know, in the last couple of days, there have been a large number of media outlets in the United States which have condemned this as an attack on free speech. I do hope they will speak louder and stop this, because the relations between Iran and the United States must get on an even keel, but continuing with this hostile, one-sided pressure, I don't think really is going to be conducive. And as I said, we have seen its failure during the past 4 years.
Marzieh, that's a very good Farhang there makes, right? So we know certainly, and I imagine there still are some people in Iran who would very much be for the deal to survive, certainly, and are probably in some ways looking for good relations with the Americans, despite what they have done and what they may continue to do towards their country. But I imagine that number is becoming less and less, because even on the reformist side, quote unquote, I imagine there are probably a lot of people who are questioning if this is all worth it.
Well, I think if you look, you mentioned the reformist side. If we go back 8 years ago with the election of Mr. Rouhani as president, and I think a lot of people voted for him with the hope that sanctions would be lifted and the situation economically would get better for Tehran. That not only didn't happen, it got much worse. All the promises that the Rouhani administration had made to the people, I feel that the majority of the electorate felt that he did not keep it. Thus, we have seen now Mr. Raisi has been elected as the incoming president. And I definitely think that there are less Iranians who have any type of hope in this deal. But one thing, obviously, everyone here would like to see a situation better economically, but not at the price of losing its independence. And that's been the whole thing all the time. And we have already seen the Biden administration hinting that Iran needs to come back to the table, come back to the deal, and also include the missile systems. And of course, the leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, has said that absolutely no more negotiations, only the deal that was made, if they want to return to that. And of course, first the United States returns to it, and then they have to prove that it is actually working, meaning the sanctions have really been lifted, and it takes several months to make sure that that process really is intact and it is working. And at that time, then Iran can return. Otherwise, Iran is not going to continue to abide by a deal that the other parties are not abiding by. So I think that this is where we stand right now. People are looking inwards. They're looking to Iran itself. They're looking at what is called a resistance economy, concentrating on domestic production. And of course, as the incoming president has said, Iran is open to the world. We want to deal with everyone, all countries, but on equal footing.
Very well. Unfortunately, the clock and the best of us. We really appreciate all three of our guests for taking their time out of their busy schedules. Marzieh, Farhang, and James speaking to us from Tehran, Caversham, and Sackville, respectively. We were discussing there a number of issues related to Iran. So firstly, the website seizures, 33 websites seized by the U.S. government for, as they've claimed, acting against or violating, in fact, U.S. sanctions. And secondly, disinformation campaigns. Then on top of that, we've had this act of sabotage, as Iran is claiming, against one of his atomic organization buildings. And then on top of this all is the huge context of the Vienna talks and the revival of the nuclear deal. Will that happen or not? Will the U.S. walk back into the deal? It's not like it's just a bilateral deal. It's a multilateral deal. So what are the other parties going to do if the U.S. is not successful, or if the Iranians decide to walk away? I mean, there's a lot of open questions, but will this sort of pressure tactic specifically against media really work? Or will this in fact blow up in the U.S.'s face, so to speak? I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in the final segment of today's show, we're going to be discussing a UN report that has come up about children, specifically in conflict zones. And this is all, of course, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The United Nations saying since the pandemic has begun, the situation for children in those conflict zones has become significantly worse, with around 90% or so, I believe, was the number, have been, exploited in some form or another. In and of itself, obviously, because of the economic crisis that has been brought about because of the pandemic, I imagine this is not a complete surprise. However, of course, I want to understand the situation a bit better with our expert who is joining us today to discuss this just a little bit further. We're now joined by Bill Bowring, who is a professor of law. He's an expert in human rights and international law at Birkbeck College at the University of London. He's joining us today from Bill, thank you very much for taking your time out of your busy schedule. I wanted to ask a very basic question to begin with, Bill. Why do you think it is that within the pandemic things have become worse for children? Was I right to point out that this is down to the economic crisis, or do you think that this is something else going on?
I think the United Nations systems have been extremely strained, actually. We have a situation where basically the Western world as a whole, the North, is not taking seriously what the United Nations, and particularly the World Health Organization, has been saying about vaccinating the world. And I think the normal systems that kick in the case of conflict and disaster have either not been able to or are extremely stretched. It's a question of resources as well. And this is also the moment at which the British government has decided to drastically cut spending on international aid. And that's in particular for disaster and conflict resources, and in particular for children. So I think this is a perfect storm, if you like, of circumstances with COVID, with the pressure that the UN is under, with the consequences of Trump, and with the fact that we now have conflict which is spreading, which is appearing in different parts of the world, and a very dynamic international situation in general.
Bill, I've heard the term used, lost generation, a number of times for different situations, but would it be an overstatement to say that we are going to have a lost generation now because of what has happened during the pandemic?
So even in rich countries, and the country, I'm not in London, by the way, I'm in Colchester. It's about 100 kilometers away from London because of lockdown. I can't visit my university office for a year now. But even in England, which is, I think, supposed to be or Britain, which is supposed to be the 5th richest country in the world, children have suffered dreadfully as a result of the pandemic and, of course, the policies of the government. So we now have a record number of very poor children who get free school meals and otherwise wouldn't eat during the day. Child poverty has risen dramatically in the United Kingdom. It was bad already. And children have basically missed out on nearly a whole year of schooling. For many children, that is absolutely drastic. And apparently, in the last week, 250,000 children, 250,000 children, have not been attending school because children in their schools have tested positive. So even in one of the richest countries in the world, where the vaccination program, it's, I think, more or less the same in Europe and the United States, but a lot of people have been vaccinated. We now have dramatically rising numbers of COVID, the new variant COVID Delta in the country. 41% rise in people requiring hospitalization in the last week. This is Britain. So I think if you look at the global south, actually, it's an absolutely disastrous situation. I think if we're looking at Africa, at Asia, much of Asia, Africa in particular, the Indian subcontinent, and of course, where has the Delta variant come from? It's come from India, primarily, and there's now a new, more resistant variant apparently coming from Nepal.
Bill, as a final thought then before I let you go, if the vaccinations in and of themselves are not the solution, then what is? I mean, how then does one protect the world's children? Because we've been told over and over again by doctors that we all need to be vaccinated around the world. And at the beginning, you heard, of course, of the pandemic and especially of the vaccination drives, even Antonio Guterres saying that there was, vaccine apartheid. A lot of such terms were being used, very heavy terms. Is that the solution? Is it that we all need to be vaccinated and then we can then worry about child exploitation, et cetera?
I think for that, we're now looking years ahead, 2 or 3 years ahead. And as a matter of fact, in Britain, I repeat, 5th richest country in the world, children have not so far been vaccinated. And yet the main source of infection of the new variant is schools. Children are back at school are not being vaccinated. And I think that is so that's the global north. And then you can imagine, and there are very strong figures, in the global south, it's an absolute disaster.
Very well, Bill. There, that, but we really appreciate you taking your time out of your schedule to speak to us today. That was Bill Bowring speaking to us today from Colchester in the UK. We were discussing there the UN report into child exploitation, specifically within the pandemic, and the UN saying it's become significantly worse, especially in conflict zones such as the DRC, Somalia, Syria, and Myanmar, but also in many, many other hot zones around the world. We'll, of course, keep a very close eye on that here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.